Okay. Happy Friday. Happy Friday. Let's see if I can get my screen order to the bottom. Got it. Okay, cool. Let's move this up. And then let's change this to here. All right. Happy Friday. So I guess I'll just jump right into it. You know, it's been a long week, but I'm getting better and better at these live streams, so I can be more time efficient with the way that I express my points and the overall thesis of each respective video call. With that in mind, today what I'd like to talk about is why there is a gender war and the cultural, evolutionary, psychological aspects of what keeps it going. Now, of course, being as though this is only meant to be a 15 to 30 minute live stream, there's no way I'm going to go completely into every single angle of it. Why there is a war between the sexes, and to be honest, like I don't mean to be a delusional idealist. To some extent or another, there will always be a war between the sexes. I think the moment there is no longer a war between the sexes and there's genuinely peace between males and females cross culturally, that's when we have achieved a form of world peace, which is well beyond impractical. But if I can at least raise the idea to a few people in such a way as to inspire you to behave in a way that benefits your daily life with whatever significant other you have or are building a relationship with or hope to achieve someday, then I sincerely hope that you take the overall moral of today's live stream into heavy consideration hereafter. Now, to guide what I'd like to say to start off, let me show you what I have written today. And this really came at the top of my mind, right? There's not a whole lot of planning that went into this. Actually, there wasn't any planning at all that went into this. I just wrote these. As anyone who's been following me for longer than 5 minutes can tell, my posts I just write off the cuff. They may seem very eloquently written, however, they are ultimately written as they come to me. There's no content plan per se when it comes to posts like these. So let me read this to you. Posted 4 hours ago from this very live stream. We often blame women for their detachment from males. Deep thinkers tend to cite how it stems from cultural evolution, as women have had to adapt to new men from warring tribes who otherwise conquered their husbands. While that may be true to some extent, I see a lack of empathy for men in that historical analysis. The other side to that, for the same reasons, ties heavily into why men detach from women, because the door swings both ways, essentially. Let me show myself 1 second. Can I show myself? I'm sure I can. Okay, here we go. There we go. All right. Now, imagine it. Two people genuinely love each other. Truly. The husband was not a lesser man. He was just a member of the lesser army who lost. He is held captive and often forced to watch while his woman is taken right in front of him, assaulted, and forced to yield offspring of the rival tribe. So what does a good man on the losing side do with his heart? And what does a good woman do with her own? I just feel like I see more than most do when reading or listening to these analyses. The love has always been real on both sides of the gender warfare. Both have merely had to harden their hearts as they've dealt with trauma. if Temujin himself did not truly love Borte, when he had no choice but to flee and leave her behind for the greater good of his tribe, his trauma from the experience would not have turned him into the Khan of Khans upon his return to rescue her. Right? Temujin is the original name of Genghis Khan. Right? So if you know anything about the story of Genghis Khan, there's a lot of information out there on him. But if you know me at all, you'll know that I take a fascination with conquerors: Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, various Roman emperors, Marcus Aurelius. I like them, and I relate to them a lot, and depending upon what angle of which story that we're talking about. Now, with that said, to give a brief overview, I mean a really brief overview of an oversimplified, admittingly oversimplified overview of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was the son of a tribal leader of a Mongolian tribe that was very small, but rivaled with another clan. Then his father was poisoned while he was still a young boy, and that caused his father was assassinated by the rival clan, and that caused a series of unfortunate events that spanned over nearly 40 years of suffering as this man came of age and progressed into becoming the conqueror of legend known as Genghis Khan. His original name was Temujin, and while he was as tough as you'd expect of Mongolian royalty, even if at the time his tribe was small, he still had a heart. He was still a human being. He hadn't quite transformed into what other nations deemed to be the monster, or what he even referred to himself as the wrath of God later on in life. And so if you haven't, I mean, there's a lot of different movies out there. I highly recommend watching the movie Mongol. It pretty much it's his coming of age story. Highly recommend. But there's also a lot of books out there that I've read as well pertaining to Genghis Khan. With that said, that's just one example, because we also have to be aware of the dark side of people like Genghis Khan, and that is the mass industrialized, systemic sexual assault of innocent people due to his either inability to conquer his trauma, or, and we'll never know this for certain, but either his inability to conquer his trauma or the complete individuation of the shadow wrought from his trauma. And possibly both, depending upon what time periods of his life that we're talking about. All right, that's just Genghis Khan. We could actually, there are infinite examples in cross-culturally where we have trauma leading to a hardening of the heart, which then leads to a butterfly effect of rippling consequences between the sexes and how they manifest in various forms in a way that literally leads to the development of culture itself. And even though, as we go through our daily lives, we don't necessarily, most of the time, most of us, especially as half the world lacks an inner dialogue, most of us don't actually understand or even stop to think about why the world is the way that it is in the first place, as well as why we ourselves behave the way that we do in response to the world around us as we experience it throughout the process of our own respective instances of self-actualization. And this came to mind. I'm going to digress a little bit, but when it comes to stopping and reflecting about why we are the way that we are, we could go into a multitude of conversations such as genetic memory. That's a really controversial one. But that's also ties into why I explored the Nordic side of my own ancestry. To briefly touch upon that, when I was alone in the Chinese wilderness, I had a totally different mentality than I have now. I was reckless, selfish, careless, and a borderline suicidal. I had what could be described as Doc Holliday syndrome. And by Doc Holliday, if you know who Doc Holliday is, he's another historical figure, but of American history, who there are different movies produced about him or featuring his character, historical fiction movies. But even though he was a real guy, the one that I recommend is called Tombstone, in which Kurt Russell plays as a legendary cowboy named Wyatt Earp, and Val Kilmer plays as Doc Holliday. And what throughout all the stories, the legend of Doc Holliday was that he was this cowboy who he wasn't particularly skilled at dueling. He wasn't particularly skilled at a whole lot of things, but he had such a lack of care, such a lack of attachment to his own life, that he got away with a lot of daring things that would otherwise, if you were an average person with the average fear, the average attachments, you would absolutely die or somehow otherwise fail. So he would go headfirst into duels against other people that had way more dueling experience with guns than he did. And yet he would beat them because he was in a mentality of a lack of hesitation. Kind of like the movie First Night, starring Richard Gere. Throughout the beginning of that movie, Richard Gere has Doc Holliday syndrome. Even though his character Lancelot technically takes place centuries before the historical events of Tombstone, and it's arguable that Lancelot even existed or not. But let's just entertain the hypothetical in which Lancelot was a real character, and King Arthur's kingdom did actually exist, right? Which it likely did in some form, but that's another conversation. Lancelot had the same sort of mentality, at least as depicted in the movie First Night, starring Richard Gere. He begins the movie unbelievably skilled at what he did, but then he beats when he's this traveling wanderer who makes a living, basically being like a swordsman for show and a sword for hire. And when someone who admires his sword skill that he beats in a duel, a friendly duel, asks him how he does it, I think he lists three aspects of his skill, but the first two, the admirer says, okay, I can do that, but the very last one he says, and you have to not care whether you live or die. And the admirer couldn't honestly say that, because he did care whether he lived or died, and it was because he cared that he lived or died was the reason why he would never be able to surpass the swordsmanship skill of someone like Richard Gere's Lancelot, because that extra element, that lack of hesitation, that lack of fear, led him to behave recklessly in a way that just made him a brazen, brilliant swordsman, in the same way that Doc Holliday's recklessness, his lack of attachment to living, made him leagues beyond in skill overnight in gun dueling, even though he was not actually a trained gunner or gunsman. With that said, I had this Doc Holliday syndrome while in the mountains of China. In fact, that's why I went into the mountains of China to begin with. I didn't consciously understand why I did that at the time, but in retrospect, I think I would like to believe, my theory is that I was driven by genetic memory that led me into climbing the mountains, the nearby mountains of my vicinity, to both test fate and to find out why, a reason to live. I forget who it was. I forget his name, but he was famous for climbing Mount Everest, and he broke records for climbing Mount Everest. And when he came down, I think he climbed Mount Everest without any extra gear or something. I forget the details of it, but I'm sure with a quick Google search you can find out about him. He climbed down to Mount Everest from Mount Everest, having broken records in the way that he climbed it. Reporters asked him, "Why did you go up there to die?" And he said, "I didn't. I went up there to live." What does that mean? It sounds like he also had Doc Holliday syndrome. And so that was the mentality that I had going into the Chinese mountains in Shanxi province. I didn't care so much whether I lived or died. I was simultaneously in an immature mentality that led me to tempt fate. Throughout the process, I was lacking severe self-awareness, because one has to beg the question: wait, why choose the mountains? Why that? Why that is your challenge? Because there's an infinite number of things to do. Why that? And then while up there in the mountains for weeks at a time, not always, but often weeks at a time, in between school semesters going on, because in order to maintain my visa obligations in China, I was working as a private English school teacher. And because it was a private school, it was operating on its own semester schedule. So we would only have school for a few months at a time. And then after every 3 months or so, there would be a break for like 3 to 4 weeks. And during those 3 to 4 weeks, I would break off I would disappear into the mountains for increase. So I didn't start off 3 to 4 weeks, but like I first started off for a few days and then gradually built my skill. And then, eventually was able to extend how long I could endure living in the mountains for what ended up becoming weeks at a time with very limited gear. Even though I do prefer to have gear. So to me, it wasn't about pride. It wasn't about proving how big I was or how tough I was. But I did have this syndrome because I was in a lot of emotional anguish. And I pushed myself to the edge, trying to find, even if I didn't admit it to myself, a reason to live, which obviously I found, else I wouldn't be here. But I died metaphysically, figuratively, in the mountains. But that's another story that I could go on and on about. Digressing too far to go into would digress too far from the point of this live stream. But anyway, I had this mentality, not understanding what drove me into the mountains. There's actually a Nordic song written by Einar Selvik. And if you don't know who Einar Selvik is, he became famous for the development of much of the Vikings TV show soundtrack. But outside of the Vikings TV show, he has a song that's about climbing a mountain, and it's about how the mountain heals you. And that struck a chord with me because, and I came to this conclusion about genetic memory before this song was released, but it struck a chord with me because it sort of confirmed, to me at least, I know this can be attacked scientifically in a whole lot of different ways, but this is just simply my belief, that I was driven by other factors that were not as obvious to the naked eye. And I believe a lot of that had to do with my Scandinavian heritage. I think, and it's also, it's good to note that within Scandinavia, it is a constitutional right to roam and climb mountains, even if you cross into private property, depending upon which Scandinavian country that we're talking about, because it's wandering and climbing mountains, especially for spiritual healing. And this is before I even knew about it. This is before because it was actually after I went into the mountains that I began to question, wait, how did I end up here? What shadow possessed me into climbing this mountain, or range of mountains actually? And now that it's winter, why aren't I dead yet? And I have limited gear. Why do I have this cold resistance? And this is a very controversial topic that would lead into a different live stream. But my point is, it was this self-reflection that made me question why I am the way that I am. Why did I behave the certain ways that I behave? And I started acquiring self-awareness and really developing that inner monologue, which ties into the war between the sexes, because as I've touched upon genetic memory, a lot of that, as to why males and females continually war against each other, has a lot to do with the genetic passing down of trauma. Emotional anguish leading into generational shadows, that Jungian shadows that possess whoever it is that we're talking about respectively, into warring with the opposite sex, even if the other sex in a given scenario didn't really do anything wrong. And now we could go into a variety of DSM-5 issues, DSM-5 declared issues, such as women who have borderline personality disorder, people have NPD, et cetera, and how they treat their significant others in a variety of different scenarios. But overall, much of that is genetic. Borderline personality disorder is largely genetic. Narcissistic personality disorder, largely genetic. So there's a lot of truth to this pertaining to the generational inheritance, the bequeathing of the hardening of the heart and how we respond to emotional pain, vulnerability, various forms of anguish that may have nothing to do with us, as 99% of our own thoughts aren't actually our own, but passed down to us as though ghosts from previous ancestors. So when I talk about the war between the sexes, with this level of self-awareness in mind, you start to look at everything, the red pill community, the blue pill community, if that's what you want to call them. You start to, you start to look at everything differently when you think, you dig deeper into the nature of why, the origins of how all of this began, pre-feminist movement. I'm talking about over thousands of years of cultural development, of tit for tat, and why things are the way that they are. And you'll go into the deeper you explore that rabbit hole, the deeper you allow yourself to tumble down that rabbit hole, the further and further back in time you go, to the extent where there are aspects of history that we'll never know for certain because we go past pre-recorded history. And at that point, we can only extrapolate. We can only hypothesize what has caused the hardening of the hearts between the sexes. So, as we go forward with this, a historical example, since the Norse heritage stemming from over 1,000 years ago, here's how, using Norse culture as an example, a minor example, I respond to one of my readers, as you can see here. My thoughts on this are probably why I am barred, someone like me would be barred from Valhalla, but could be accepted in the Folkvanger according to my religious beliefs. Valhalla is ruled by Odin, Folkvanger is ruled by Freya. Sorry, you can tell I speak different language. If I start to roll my tongue, it's not because I'm like trying to fake an accent. It's like, no, I'm multilingual. So when I read other words from other languages, sometimes that it happens. Like I code switch, but it's not intentional. To the Norse, some argue that my softer heart and empathy make me a flawed product, despite however well trained and experienced I may be in martial arts and military matters. If I was to die on a battlefield or in some kind of fight, Odin would likely reject me and relegate me to spend the rest of eternity protecting the women, meaning Folkvanger, since I have such a soft, protective heart for them. I should have been hardened by now, but the opposite has happened despite the increase in other forms of strength. And the reason why I've been able to retain my empathy is largely, if not entirely, to do with this deep self-reflection about why I am the way that I am. Why would my heart harden, despite whatever heartbreak or other emotional anguish I've gone through in life? And we don't have to necessarily go into the romance of it. We could go into Freud. We can go into Freudian psychology, like what happened between me and my parents. We could go into more deeper into Jung, but without the reference of the shadow. We could go into the other aspects of the archetypes, Jungian archetypes, and how if you sort of cross-reference that with Freud, how people like me we tend to develop what's called the Hamlet complex, or versus people who develop the Oedipal complex. There's a lot we could go into that, again, you can tell I have a lot of knowledge that I need more than 15 to 30 minutes to really flesh out. In fact, I need a whole video series to flesh out. But to keep things succinct, stop warring with the other sexes. Stop warring with the other sex. And the way to do that, the best way that I have found to maintain the softness of your heart, even if society may look down on you for it or criticize you for it, is by first understanding that most of your thoughts are not your own. if there's something about the opposite sex, right? And note how I'm wording myself, the opposite sex, meaning if you're a woman, this could apply to men. If you're a man, this could apply to men. It doesn't really matter who it is that I'm speaking to. Whoever is opposite to you, whoever you are, understand and operate from the assumption that 99% of your own thoughts aren't actually yours. They are either absorbed from other influences external to you, or inherited from ancestors that are a part of your own genetic memory that you're just not consciously aware of. And as long as you're able to set that aside, these factors aside, when trying to narrow down which thoughts in your head are actually yours, you begin to realize that most of your suffering isn't actually yours, or doesn't have to be yours. Allowing you to see clearly, even if someone of the opposite sex hurts you, to see clearly with compassion, despite how hard you may be in other ways. And I'm saying this, right? I don't sound like some super tough alpha male, quote unquote, when in fact, you'd be surprised of my history when it comes to the military and martial arts and the way what I've experienced, the multitude of adventures I've experienced around the world. I could flaunt I could flaunt the stereotypical aspects of masculinity, but I simply choose not to out of humility. By understanding that most of those kinds of guys are just really, really severely insecure. They need therapy, right? Whereas someone like me, I understand and can speak from a much deeper place of awareness and understanding without having to go out of my way to prove how masculine I am or should be or could be. And with that in mind, even if someone of the opposite sex hurts you, try to push through your pain. Develop the inner strength enough to steel yourself from reacting and instead observe. Breathe and observe and understand that in the vast majority of cases, how someone may treat you has little to nothing to do with you, and has everything to do with them. And from that premise, war with yourself rather than them to maintain the compassion of your soul. Even if others around you may think you a flawed product because of it. For the sake of being a genuinely good person and breaking the generational traumas that keep the gender war going. And as I've been saying, or as I said earlier in this call, right when I began this call, this stream, take a moment to understand how you are swept up in a an infinitely chain-linked series of consequences, tying into prepositional calculus that extends far beyond your epistemological limitation, far beyond what your mortal brain can interpret, can imbibe and interpret. Well beyond what you could possibly control. And let go. Let go of what you cannot control and focus on what you can. And while, to speak pragmatically, the gender war may never actually end, at least not holistically pertaining to the bird's eye view of all humanity, What you can do is at least keep these thoughts in mind for the sake of improving your own life in tiny ways, day by day. You may not be able to control other people's lives. You may not be able to save the world. But you can at least save yourself in this context. You can at least take baby steps in improving yourself as an individual and thus your own life on a day-to-day basis, actionably. Questions? Let's check it out. Let's see. Do we have anything? Well, let me check. No, let me check over here. Anything? It's Friday. I might not. I think a lot of people are out partying on Fridays. I'm a family man, so I'm an introvert and a family man, so. Clary says, maybe it is being in this state is somehow feeling more freely alive without inhibition. Just thinking in reference to Doc Holliday syndrome. Checking X. Not seeing anything on X. So there is one comment so far. Yeah, not seeing anything on X. And checking, not seeing anything on YouTube. So just checking the one. I see the one. So Clarice, thank you very much for your comment. And as there are no questions, I might not hold streams on Fridays then. If it seems like at this time most people are like drained from the week, or they might be out partying or spending time with their families. But that's fine. I totally empathize with that. I'm the workaholic who's constantly, even though I'm at home, I constantly work, or from the time I wake up to the time I go to sleep, I'm constantly working, unless I'm spending time with my family. They are my life. All right. Have a nice weekend. See you next Monday. This coming Monday.